Welcome to episode 29 of the Time Talks podcast. This month I had the honor to speak to Dr. Brenda Child. Dr. Child was born in the Red Lake Ojibwe Reservation in northern Minnesota and is a professor at the University of Minnesota, as well as a scholar, researcher, and author of books such as Boarding School Seasons, American Indian Families 1900 to 1940, Holding Our World Together, Ojibwe Women and the Survival of Community, Indian Subjects, Hemispheric Perspectives on the History of Indigenous Education, My Grandfather's Knocking Sticks, Ojibwe Family Life and Labor on the Reservation, and a children's book called Bow Wow Pow Wow. In this episode, we spoke about the American Indian movement, Indigenous representation, the Jingle dress dance, Standing Rock, Ojibwe culture, and boarding schools. Thank you to Awareness for the Music. Please support the podcast on Patreon, and here is a jingle from another Channel Zero Network member.
Rebel Steps is a podcast about taking action. Season 1 offered insights into how individuals can join movements. Season 2 focuses on the ways people can work together to build these movements. Organizing in groups presents many challenges. How do you care for each other and protect each other in the midst of political struggle? How do you lift up the voices of everyone in your group? How do you work through the inevitable disagreements? All of these questions have complicated answers. As I explore these questions, you'll hear voices and stories from my community in New York City, spotlighting a range of organizers from the Metropolitan Anarchist Coordinating Council, Outlive Them, Pop Gem, Democratic Socialists of America Libertarian Socialist Caucus, and more. Just like the first season, I return to Paulo Freire's quote, "What can we do today so that we can do tomorrow what we cannot do today?" But this time with the realization that building our capacity will necessarily happen alongside others. Find Rebel Steps on Spotify, iTunes, or wherever you get your podcasts, and check us out on Twitter or Patreon.
So my first question was, wondering if you could speak about what led you into being a writer and a scholar, and maybe a moment or pivotal time that radicalized you into speaking out against U.S. propaganda and settler colonial power systems.
Yeah, well, that's a really great question, I think. And for me, it kind of goes back to really my childhood, which I don't know how long I want to spend talking about that. But I was always interested in studying history. And even as a kid, I had a friend. I lived in kind of rural areas growing up, so I didn't have access to a big, city library or anything like that. But I did have a friend of a friend who we used to babysit for, and she was a librarian in town. And my friend told her, well, Brenda's really interested in Indian history. And so this librarian used to bring me books. And I remember reading the biography of Sitting Bull by Stanley Vestal. And there were just lots of books at the time that I was looking for kind of ways of thinking about Indian history, even though I was a kid. So I was kind of a small child in the 1960s, but around 69, 70, I was only 10 years old, but around that time, Vine Deloria wrote his well-known book, Custer Died for Your Sins. And then in 1970, this book came out that was really a big influence on me called Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. Now we know that there are some problems with Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, that the narrative is kind of a victimry narrative and doesn't show Indian agency in the way that we'd write it now. But at the same time, I think he introduced some really important talks and ideas that I had never heard about in, my American history classes up to that point. So I think those were really the big influences on me and then, of course, just being a kid, the Vietnam War was taking place. I was only 9, 10 years old in 1968, 69, but I remember the events of that time. So I think I was a child interested in politics and history at a sort of young age. And there were all these really interesting and radical things taking place at the time.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. And also at this time was Minnesota had the founding of the American Indian movement.
That's right, yeah.
And I was wondering if you could speak to that. And, Minnesota's been known for police violence as well. And and AIM fought against, inequality, Indigenous rights, fought for that, and fought against police brutality. And we've seen, from the murders of Jamar Clark to Philando Castile to George Floyd. And I believe there was one instance of two Indigenous activists who were beat up by the police in Minnesota, then put in the trunk of the police car.
That's kind of yes. So Minnesota, even though it has a reputation for being kind of a homogenous place and so forth, and also a place for a very high standard of living, has often kind of fallen short when it comes to Native people and their issues. And so it's interesting that in the early 1970s, it was this kind of meeting ground for people of many different tribes. It was a place, the urban area, kind of drew on our reservation population statewide, and we have 11 federally recognized tribes in Minnesota. And then we also have people from the Dakotas and the Northern Plains and Wisconsin who, came to live in Minneapolis and St. Paul. So there was this urban Indian population that especially grew in the post-war years. But also there were always Indian people here, because right here in the Twin Cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul, that's the homeland of Dakota people. And so it's not just that people immigrated to an urban area in the post-war years, although some of that was taking place, but there were also Native people who were living here at that time. And Minneapolis and St. Paul kind of grew up around the Indian population that had always been here. So that, I think, is one of the factors that made Minneapolis and St. Paul a kind of vibrant place for Indian activism in the 1970s. And even though I wasn't part of that movement, I could kind of watch it from, my home communities of Red Lake Reservation way up in northern Minnesota, which is 5 hours north of Minneapolis. So it wasn't like I was close. But I did have a cousin, and I did have an uncle or an aunt who lived here in the Twin Cities. And so we were aware of what was going on, because people always kind of moved back and forth between the reservation communities and the city. And I remember as a kid, kind of in the early 1970s, I must have been maybe 13, 14 when I started getting interested in the activism taking place in urban areas. And at that time, I remember seeing a long-haired Indian guy who had a T-shirt that said, "Indian and Proud." And I thought, that is a really good T-shirt. And it sort of made me think like there's something very vibrant and interesting going on in the cities. And so the American Indian movement was, there were different centers of it around the Bay Area in California, but certainly Minneapolis was one of the real meeting grounds for Native people at that time. And so there were men, and I should say many women who are not kind of as well known, who were also part of that movement in the 1970s. And there was a lot of work going on. The early meetings, a lot of them did. It's interesting the moment we find ourselves in, because a lot of the early meetings, my understanding is, were about police violence in the Twin Cities directed at American Indians.
Thank you for sharing that history and those stories there. I appreciate that. And I wanted to move into this piece you wrote in Public Historian titled The Absence of Indigenous Histories in Ken Burns National Parks, America's Best Idea.
Yeah, thanks for reading that.
Oh, yeah, I really liked it. And as a history teacher who was always told by curriculums to show Ken Burns, and then him missing so much, and they're always very long too, 10 discs of baseball on each topic, and it's always very Eurocentric, I feel, his documentaries. So this documentary went from 1851 to 1970, ending in Alaska. And I was wondering if you could talk about this piece you wrote, if Ken Burns responded, and overall representation of Indigenous histories in the media and curriculums. Yeah,
I think that documentary is really an interesting one, especially because Ken Burns is, he was sort of coming off the documentary he had made about World War II, which was very popular. Everybody watched it on public TV. But he was really soundly criticized after that for not including Chicano Latinx perspectives. Native people, were kind of made an appearance in it, and there were some good moments, but I think that many people felt that they were sort of shortchanged by Ken Burns and his storytelling, even though I always find that I get very drawn into his documentaries because there is great storytelling that takes part, and I think that World War II is a very good example. I get drawn into all of those stories that people tell. But so I think when he made the series on the national parks, my understanding is he was very motivated by environmental issues, especially kind of the issues of drilling in Alaska. And he wanted to make a film that talked about, environmentalism, which I appreciate as well, right? I appreciate that point of view. But when he actually got down to the storytelling, he did try to insert stories of diversity. And I know there is one about a really interesting Asian American park ranger, right, in the Pacific Northwest, and artists who were very influenced by their experience in the national parks. But I think where he really fell short in talking about the national parks is in any way addressing Native people and their history and presence in the national parks. And so if you talk to Native people anywhere in the country, we know that the national parks were carved out of Indigenous homelands. And so it's very problematic that, I don't know if that series is 12 hours long or something like that. My colleague Carl Jacoby, we were on a panel in D.C. that actually a lot of people from the National Park Service attended, and Carl Jacoby mentioned how many minutes were devoted to Indian history in Ken Burns' documentary. And I can't remember exactly, but it was like seconds. It was like 90 seconds. It was just, you couldn't even imagine, right? And so he tells the story often about the history of the United States where Native people have disappeared from the landscape. And I know when he talks about Yosemite in that documentary, the Indians, were there, but they're kind of part of this distant past. So he leaves out any kind of political story about American Indian dispossession and the creation of national parks. And he doesn't really see Native people as being, cultures that are alive and present today. So I think even though he's kind of an amazing storyteller, I think there are some big omissions in the way that he looks at American history. And so the piece that I wrote about, I thought, well, I'm not going to try to talk about everything, but I did want to talk about Native people in the Great Lakes, even though it's not, we do have, especially in the form of Voyageurs National Park, it's out in the middle of Lake Superior. It's a place where they say that it's the place where wolves have been studied for decades, more than almost any other area of the United States. So I wanted to write about Native people, which includes land along the border of the U.S. and Canada, which is very popular today for, going into kind of a pristine wilderness, and it's especially popular with canoeists. So Ojibwe people, lived in that part of the country, and that's where I'm from. And so what I wanted to do was kind of document how Native people were dispossessed from their homelands. In the case of Quetico, that kind of boundary area between the U.S. and Canada, Indian people had allotments up there, and they lived up there. And then after the creation of these parks, they were kind of treated as, when they wanted to go out hunting, they were considered poachers now on national land. And so that's very problematic. And so when you think of Ken Burns comes out and says, well, this is America's greatest idea, the national parks, you can imagine how Native people feel about that, because that was a great injustice. And so you look at other tribal histories, Blackfeet people and Glacier National Park and that kind of thing, and I think you get across the board a pretty compelling story about Native dispossession. fortunately, there have been some scholars who've kind of come along and have written about American Indians and national parks. And so I think there's beginning to be some kind of balance. But I also want to tell your listeners about a good project that I'm involved in. I was really interested, I've been really interested for the past 10 or 15 years in writing about a dance tradition that's that kind of emerged out of the Great Lakes Ojibwe communities. And you can see it if you go to a powwow these days, that women perform something called the Jingle dress dance. And I've been learning that this tradition came out of the pandemic of 1918-19. And so I've been talking a lot about that and actually have a small exhibition at a museum in central Minnesota that kind of tells that history. Well, I have a colleague, Eugene Tapahi, who's a Navajo fine art photographer, and his daughters happen to be jingle dress dancers because the tradition is now spread across the United States and Canada among women, Indigenous women. And so he went out this past spring and summer, and what he wanted to do was to document Native people's presence in our national parks. So he took his daughters and their friends to the various national parks. He lives in Utah, so from Utah, Nevada, out to California, Yosemite, those parks out there. And in fact, he went up to Glacier and Yellowstone as well. But he just took fabulous pictures of these jingle dress dancers in national parks. And he wanted to call attention to Native dispossession, but also our contemporary presence. And he also, his daughters had these scarves, red scarves that were printed that would kind of acknowledging the present problem of missing and murdered Indigenous women. So that was the other issue he wanted to call attention to. So he has an art exhibit that's opening early next month in Salt Lake City called Art Heals, that talks about Native dispossession in photographs, and that's just a hot off the press kind of story because he's just been doing it the last few months. He came out to Minnesota to visit us in August because we wanted to go around. We know that the flu pandemic of 1918-19 was really devastating to Native communities, and that's why we kind of got involved in this jingle dress project. But I started doing it, developing this exhibit and writing about it long before I knew that there was going to be a second pandemic. But I invited Eugene Tapahi out to Minnesota because we wanted to sort of document Native people in this second pandemic. That, a century ago, there was this whole new healing tradition that Ojibwe people created out of that first pandemic. So we wanted to be sure that we were documenting what was going on in Ojibwe communities today, which included actually photographing a lot of jingle dress dancers on our various Ojibwe reservations in Minnesota, at Mille Lacs in central Minnesota, up on the Leech Lake Reservation in northern Minnesota. We spent a lot of time there.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. I would love to have to make the trip to Salt Lake to see that. That sounds amazing. Yeah, or, I don't know what things are going online, but if you look at his, you can, I don't know what the address is, but if you Google Eugene Tapahi, Tapahe, you can take a look at his website and see some of his photographs. Okay, I'll link that in the show notes as well.
Yeah, thank you. You might want to call him. He would have a lot to say about the national parks.
Okay, yeah, that would be, he can be a future guest maybe. That would be awesome.
Yeah.
And with the disappeared Indigenous women ties right into, drilling and fracking and the man camps and all of those situations that are going on in Calling Light too.
Yeah, that is a big part of the story.
And I was going to ask you about jingle dresses next, actually, and I think you already covered a lot of it, but I was going to ask about, you had mentioned that the U.S. government had banned American Indian rituals in 1921, and you've mentioned the jingle dress as being anti-colonial as well in that regard, and that it goes back to healing during the influenza pandemic. And it was also at Standing Rock, the jingle dress was used again, and now being used during COVID. And I think you've already spoke to about. I was going to ask about the significance of the jingle dress during Standing Rock to the pandemic.
Right. Well, it's kind of interesting how these paths kind of crisscross. But I first started thinking about, I'd written this editorial for the New York Times that came out in May about the history of the jingle dress dance. And in that article, I sent a copy of Eugene Tapahi's photograph of the jingle dress dancers at Standing Rock because I thought it was such an incredibly striking photograph that captured so much about that moment, right? Because there was a strong law enforcement presence. And while sometimes you read about Standing Rock and you think that, it was this tremendous show of force of Native people, very empowering to them, and also a lot of friendship and happiness, right, that took place at those camps. But there was also that law enforcement and kind of that military presence that's part of the Standing Rock story, too. And I think what Eugene does so beautifully is kind of capture the fear because people, as we know, also put their lives on the line to go out and protest and be part of that movement at Standing Rock. So I encourage you to take a look at that photograph that is in my piece in the New York Times. And the piece, if you just Google when art is medicine, you'll see the op-ed that comes up in the New York Times piece. But I do in there, as well as in some of my scholarly work, talk about the origin of the jingle dress dance tradition. And it was, historical documents show that Native communities were very devastated by the influenza of 1918-19, which is interesting, has some interesting parallels to what's going on today because we're seeing that the present pandemic disproportionately affects communities of color in the United States. And so I kept running across in the course of doing research, sometimes on other subjects, because my first book was about American Indian children who attended government boarding schools. And it really was there that I kept running across this story of influenza. At one of the schools, there were several hundred students that were sick of influenza. And it got me, a number of years ago, reading about health issues because I think I consider myself really a historian of the early 20th century. And even in that era, you have to really be knowledgeable about the history of disease to understand what was taking place in our communities, in our government boarding schools, and so forth. So it was interesting to me to see that even though Native people lived in rural America, right, in 1918-19, it was a pretty rural population at that time. Most people were still speaking their tribal languages, living in rural America. But yet the pandemic was very devastating in the Great Lakes, in the Pueblos of the Southwest. And they say that in Alaska, it was so devastating to the population there that a lot of people, that new orphanages were created to care for the children that were left after the pandemic swept through Alaska Indigenous communities. And so I always kind of think, I understand why the pandemic is sort of bad in, New York City or Chicago, but why is it so virulent in rural areas as well, right? So that to me was always kind of an interesting historical problem. But just like watching this pandemic now, we don't always know how people are going to behave or how they're going to respond to crisis. And I think when I look around the country, I was just up in Bemidji, where I have live part-time, and my husband and I were up there last weekend, and Trump came to town, Bemidji, Minnesota, this town of 15,000 people. He landed there. So I guess my point is to say you don't always know how people are going to respond in a crisis. I would think people would stay home, not want to congregate and be rational. But instead, you had all these people from small towns all over the rural north congregating in Bemidji at the airport last Friday night to see Trump and be part of his rally. So you see kind of the best of human behavior, and sometimes you see the worst of human behavior. And I think that, that we're seeing a lot of bad behavior in our current pandemic. But what I've learned really from studying history, I think, is that you don't always know what's going to come out of these big events, right? And you know yourself from studying history, it's not always predictable, and people do kind of unexpected things. But from my view, I've been, after looking at this history of this terrible pandemic where we lost so many, especially young lives, because that particular influenza was very deadly to young people, making it different from the pandemic that we're currently in. And so it was frightening to people, right? The young people were dying in that epidemic a century ago. But what's interesting to me to see is out of all that devastation of that pandemic a century ago, that Ojibwe women created this whole new healing tradition, being aware that after we experience sickness in our communities and in our families and even in our own bodies, that there's a lot of trauma that's left in its aftermath. And so Ojibwe women know, and Ojibwe people generally, and other American Indians know, that you also have to deal with the psychological distress of disease. And so you have this whole new healing tradition involving dresses, new dances, new songs that came out of this epidemic a century ago. So who would have thought that, and that this healing tradition would still be with us a century later?
Oh, that's
so I'm
beautiful.
hoping that something good comes out of this one right now, too. But we don't necessarily know. There will be some great things that come out of this terrible experience we're all having, too.
You really bring up a good point about the generational difference between that pandemic of 1918 and then the one now, and how the roles are kind of reversed, to where this pandemic is killing the elders, to where it was killing people in the prime of their lives before. Yeah. And I wanted to ask you about gender and age. And you speak about how the Ojibwe word for elder woman is one who holds things together. And so I wonder if you could talk about the labor of healing, the labor of women.
Yeah.
And you explain how women are society builders and became more influential with age, and how Ojibwe culture pushed back at the settler, colonial, and capitalist goal of establishing gender norms and patriarchy.
Yeah, I think that's all part of, Native resistance. And I should say, what did I forget to address, though, in your last question, too? There's something I didn't talk about the...
was it the anti-colonialness of...
Yes. Did I even ever get to that? Let me talk about that first, and then we'll move on to your other question. So the anti-colonial part of the Jingle dress dance tradition. So you asked me about this dance order. As historians call it the dance order, but it has some official name as a circular number that came out of the Indian office in 1921. And I have a colleague, John Troutman, who's at the Smithsonian now, and he wrote a great book called Indian Blues about the politics of American Indian music, and he's kind of the expert I turn to when I want to know more about the context of that dance order. But this is kind of my understanding of it at the time. So Washington, and there was a commissioner of Indian Affairs at the time named Charles Burke, and he issues this kind of long, windy circular that goes out to all the Indian reservations, which means the Indian agents who are on the various reservations at the time, who are in the middle of the work of, assimilation, the assimilation campaign, suppressing native languages, native cultures. And here we see then, even in this kind of infamous dance order, that there is still an effort to suppress Indian dancing on reservations, that Indian dancing was thought of as being pagan, is the word that they used at the time, that it was anti-Christian, Native people were supposed to be becoming, in the view of the U.S. government, Protestants, although it was okay to them that some were becoming Catholics, but the government preferred Protestants. And so dancing was kind of frowned upon, and that one of the things that Indian agents reported on is are there still pagan dances taking place in the community, in which they were supervising Native life? And so they would write back to Washington in their annual reports and talk about things like that. Well, Native people are big dancers. We have powwows and all sorts of dances. And there are dances that are more religiously oriented, and then there are others that are more social, like the powwow is, right? But the powwows were kind of, they take this view on powwows, like, I don't know, maybe some of this dancing is harmless, but on the other hand, some of it is very pagan, and we should really just discourage it. So that's what this dance order was all about in 1921. But it occurred to me when I was doing this work on the emergence of the Jingle dress dance, when I figured out, after a long time of thinking about it, that it emerged during the time of the flu epidemic of 1918-19, and its aftermath, that this actually coincides with the government's circular forbidding ritualistic dancing on Indian reservations. I don't even know if the government at that time thought any of this was going to take hold permanently, but they wanted to discourage it, right? And so I thought from the very beginning, Native women are engaged in a kind of radical movement because they created this whole new healing tradition, still with us a century later, in the midst of this atmosphere where dancing on Indian reservations, like there's kind of a crackdown on it. Now, as Indian policy emerges in the 20s and 30s, we usually look at this as the end of the assimilation movement, right? That the federal government, reformers in the United States started to have different ideas about race, started to have different ideas about Native culture. There were some cultural pluralists who were progressive politicians at the time, right? And so you have this movement that I think kind of culminates with the election of FDR in the 1930s. And so Native people, in some ways, things were very bad in the 1920s, but it was sort of coming at the tail end of the assimilation movement. And so with FDR, he says, why go to boarding school? Let's have Indians go to public schools and logical things like that. And so some of this is kind of the last gasp of assimilation in the 1920s. But it was still a tough time to live, I think.
Thank you for explaining that history so well and laying that out. And then,
okay. Your longer question.
I'm so sorry for these long questions, but it inspires. Your writing inspires these questions. So.
So talk about women and their roles and such.
Yeah, I was just kind of thinking about the pandemic and the reversal of gender and age, and the elder woman in Ojibwe for one who holds things together.
So I wrote about this in a couple of books. One is called Holding Our World Together, and the other one is called My Grandfather's Knocking Sticks, Ojibwe Family Life and Labor on the Reservation. And in that book, I kind of take a family memoir approach in the first section of the book to talk about my own grandparents and their working lives on the reservation in the early 20th century reservation, where Indian agents were a strong presence, where Native people were being surveillance is the word that I choose to use to talk about that period of reservation life. There was this reservation system, right? So, I mean, we think about how we were condemning apartheid in South Africa, decades ago, and yet we had this reservation system where Native people were to be supervised, kind of treated as children, as people who were not really competent to govern their own, even business affairs at the time. And so I tried to write about what life was like for that generation of Native people. And I did it in a kind of personal way because my own grandparents had lived through that time. So that's in My Grandfather's Knocking Sticks. And so the approach I take is to kind of look at different occupations. Healing is one chapter, which is why I ended up writing about the Jingle dress dance, but also the collection of medicines and plant knowledge and things that Native women in particular had a lot of expertise in. But when I wrote about fishing, the labor of fishing, but especially the labor of harvesting wild rice, I came to appreciate more the historic role that Ojibwe had in their traditional economy. And it took me a while to kind of see and understand some of that history because so much has changed in the 20th and the 21st century in regard to labor practices and American Indian people. But I came to understand kind of for the first time that there was a big shift in how men and women worked on the reservation, and that before the reservations were created, and for us that was kind of a mid to late 19th century thing here in Minnesota and the Great Lakes, that women actually controlled the economy, and men were in control of politics. That is, they were the governing, most of the hereditary positions around governance involved men. Not that women were excluded completely from politics, but that was sort of their domain. But I started to appreciate that a lot of realms of labor were women, controlled by women. So I started to think about the wild rice economy, which is very important to us in the Great Lakes, go out and harvest this time of year, actually wild rice, late August and into September. But after we gather the wild rice off the lakes, there's still a very labor-intensive process of finishing the rice so that you can eat it. And so what I started to see when I went back and looked at historical documents, like in my lifetime, I've kind of looked at it as men's work, And in when I was growing up, this is why I titled my book this way. We had my grandfather's wild rice harvesting sticks on our wall, right? We had his cedar sticks that he had used. And so I always thought of this as men's work, right? When you look at something your grandparents did, most of us think of that as representing tradition and older ways of doing things. But after looking at historical documents, I started to see that in fact, women were the primary gatherers and harvesters of wild rice, that men weren't greatly involved in that kind of labor. And they decided on who would harvest where. And so I started to think about water, the rivers and headwaters and lakes where Ojibwe people harvest wild rice. And I started to think about it as a gendered space, that this is where women worked, and this was kind of their domain. So I started to have a greater appreciation for the economic roles that women had in our communities after understanding that. And there, in the old days, before Ojibwe people went out and harvested wild rice, they would go out and they would kind of bind the sheaves within the lake together. And this is kind of thought of as being a good environmental practice because, like, if you have a big storm or something, you don't lose all that wild rice. It's kind of bound together, almost like corn stalks could be bound together. And so I knew that this practice existed, and I knew that it declined in the 1930s. And I thought, why would Ojibwe people quit doing this in the 1930s? But I sort of discovered that was the decade when the government work program came into reservations to kind of help out the reservation economies during the Great Depression. But they hired men, and the men wanted to go out and work and do the harvesting of wild rice. But the government didn't think that women could do labor-intensive work like that. So they hired men to go out onto the lakes and begin harvesting wild rice. So I start to see this shift in men's and women's roles. But it's really important to kind of go back, I think, and look at the long history of how men and women organize their labor in their communities to really see the power and the influence that women had, because they pretty much controlled the traditional economy.
Thanks for sharing that. And didn't you also mention before that they had built a big lumber mill during that time, but they weren't hiring anyone from the Ojibwe community?
Yeah, so on my reservation up in Red Lake, as you can imagine, forestry is an important part of the economy. It still is. And there was the government came in during, a lot of this was early 20th century. We started a fishery at that time that was managed by the federal government. We had a sawmill that was managed by the government. And, when I say this, it sort of explains something, I think, about poverty and how Native people, in the case of my reservation, we didn't really, we maintained a significant land base. We didn't lose all our land, and as was the case with so many other tribes. And so even within that context, Indian people were sort of unemployed in their own communities because the federal government and sometimes the state governments came in and managed our resources. And so on the early 20th century at Red Lake, even though in my hometown, Red Bee, Minnesota, we had a sawmill that could have employed a lot of Indian people, those were considered good jobs. And so non-Indians were hired to be managers of the sawmill. And it really wasn't until World War II when, as we know, kind of like the Rosie the Riveter era, when Native people in my community, where my grandfather and people of his generation could get jobs there for the first time. I think my grandmother even worked there as a kind of like a secretary at that time. And so in thinking about how Indians became poor, right, we have to understand that the government always tried to run our businesses for us and exploited our resources. So they took advantage of our fisheries, they took advantage of our lumber, and they're the ones who made the contracts and organized and tried to run our business affairs. And even within our own communities, they kind of imported workers from off the reservation to do labor. So that picture doesn't change very much until World War II, when Indians start to become, as ridiculous as this sounds, employed within their own communities, right? Sometimes it's hard to explain Indian poverty, right, to non-Indian people or to our students. But I think this is maybe one way to kind of get at some of these small stories. And so if you lived on the Red Lake Reservation in the early 20th century, if the economy within your community, the new ways, holding jobs, wage labor, if that's something unavailable to you because you're an Indian, and if you try to go off the reservation and get a job in the nearby towns, that's really hard for Native people too. Yeah, because nobody's going to hire you. They're not going to hire Indians in the nearby border towns. And so the local economy, in a lot of ways, is kind of closed off to American Indians. Now so they did, I always think in the example of my grandparents, they did a dozen things to stay alive and keep their families fed, right? So they would go hunting, they would go fishing, they would harvest wild rice, they would make maple sugar, they would garden. If there were jobs available in lumbering, they would take wage labor whenever that opportunity presented itself. But I always say that American Indians living on reservations rarely had the luxury of having a single job, like so many of us. Well, not even, I don't know if that's the case in the United States, because there are a lot of people doing more than one job to keep their families going. But that's sort of the way it was for Native people up until the time of World War II, when they gained, it was possible to get a job in your local industry.
That's a really hard situation. It really shows just the violence of colonialism in creating that manufactured poverty. Right.
And I know sometimes, people have said, why are Indians poor? How you seem to have a lot of resources, right? You seem to have a lot of natural resources. And sometimes, so you have to, and for me, understanding that history of my community, it is important to see, how the ordinary opportunities, which we kind of describe as white privilege now, right? But what was that privilege in the, 100 years ago? How could someone get out with a basic high school education or less, right, go out and find a job and make a living and, get another job or rise, in your positions? How that way of living in the American economy was really closed off to a lot of people of color. And it certainly was closed off to American Indians until more recent decades. And so even in education, I teach at the University of Minnesota. We look at, in fact, I'm teaching a class right now called Chasing the American Dream, and my students yesterday all wrote their own educational biographies. And I heard, and they're a diverse group of students, but there was a lot in there about their primary school education, their parents who were employed, how they, what helped them, how they got moved to private schools when another school setting wasn't working out. And so you saw these people who were kind of set up for success, right? They're set up for graduating from college and economic success and so forth. And so that's a fine thing if that's how the system works for you. But it hasn't always worked that way for minorities in the United States. And so we get characterized historically as being Indians. The stereotype is we're lazy. You people just don't have the incentive to go out and work. And so when I look at my grandparents' generation, I think, oh my gosh, these people worked from morning till night to support their families. They did so many different kind of jobs to survive.
Yeah.
They certainly weren't lazy.
No. Yeah, and 2 points on that, like with just being able to go to a university in a dorm setting, it sets people up for the opportunity to network with other people who may have this class background to go to college and have that network where people, I went to just a community college and, I wasn't at a dorm setting, so that shows inequities. But then going back to the deeper history of what you're talking about is what's really the disservice of U.S. history and how it's taught is the whole land acts, and what Lincoln had done to create colleges was all from stolen land. And on top of that, the land was just given to white farmers and even gave them money to start farming, which was this whole inequity.
And it makes me wonder why people are so angry. They've had so much privilege. Well, and it's really, and like your point about that, and in kind of the 19th century history, we've been trying to encourage the university to think more about the fact that our university and then its other campuses up north, because we're Twin Cities, but we're also down in Rochester, up in Duluth, and way up into a town in northern Minnesota, our other branch of the University of Minnesota system, that we sit on Dakota and Ojibwe land, the universities. And 1862 in Minnesota was the year of a big war with the Dakota people that really allowed the Twin Cities to be built here at the confluence of the Mississippi and the Minnesota rivers. And so that I always say, that big real estate boom came at the expense of Dakota people who were exiled and dispossessed and sent. Many of them we have Dakota people here that remained, but others who went to Canada and had to flee the state and now live on reservations in the Dakotas or in Montana. But 1862, I like to point out, and would be a good podcast program because there are a lot of folks now doing research on the Morrill Act of 1862 that created the land-grant public universities in the United States that we like to cite as the big, in our history of American democracy, it was the land-grant universities that allowed so many people to gain a foothold and, like you were describing, come into the universities. And so that was at the expense of Indian people, just like the national parks. And so 1862, the Morrill Act, 1862, the Dakota War, it's no coincidence that those two things happened in the same year.
Thank you for pointing that out. Yeah, that would be a very important episode as well. And I'm in, so-called Denver, the homelands of the Cheyenne and Arapaho. And that's where, in history, I had to teach Colorado history. It was just a blip of talking about Indigenous history, even though it's been the land for millennia, and it goes straight to a gold rush, in a Colorado historical narrative. And it doesn't speak of, Denver still has statues that say the Sand Creek Battle instead of what it was, Sand Creek Massacre, and these narratives of history.
Have you had Ari Kellman on your show, who wrote that book about historical memory and the Sand Creek Massacre?
No, but I've used that in my class. That would be a great person to have.
Yeah, you should talk to him. He's very engaging. I think he's a real fun person to talk to. He teaches out at UC Davis in the history department out there. But he'd be a good guest on your show for Colorado and Denver history.
Great, yeah. Thank you for that suggestion. Next, I wanted to ask you about boarding schools in American Indians.
Yeah.
You've done deep research in the archives.
Yeah.
You've written about from Haskell in Kansas to Flandreau in South Dakota, and Pipestone in Minnesota. And you told the wonderful story of Lucien.
Oh, yeah, that was in my grandfather's knocking sticks, who had been a Haskell student, right?
And she's a volunteer nurse during the 1918 flu epidemic. And I love this wicked and humorous letter that she wrote to her friend that you spoke about, where she wanted her teacher to die, and she had to apologize about it.
You know, she's 19 years old. You know, you can see that playfulness and the spirit that she has in that letter that's so wonderful. Yeah, that's a great letter. I copied that letter in its entirety in my book, My Grandfather's Knocking Sticks, because it was the story of a young woman who wasn't necessarily intending to be a nurse, but that was what expectations were for women at the time. So she ends up, after she graduates from Haskell boarding school in Lawrence, Kansas, goes on a train, ends up in D.C. at a nursing program or a jobs program for young Native women who'd graduated from boarding school. And so she gets sent out to one of the Army hospitals, and she's there in the fall of 1918 during the height of the influenza pandemic in Washington. And so it's just an incredible story. So she writes a 7-page letter back to her friend Louise at the boarding school, and she talks about all sorts of things in her life, but she also tells the story of what it's like to be a nurse, a volunteer nurse in the military hospital. And I often think about it, that letter. My daughter is 19 years old, too, and I was thinking about what a responsibility and how they were sending young people with no medical training, endangering their lives to go and assist and help out during this crisis of the big influenza pandemic of 1918-19. So that letter you can take a look at in My Grandfather's Knocking Sticks. But I think part of the reason that letter appealed to me, just like, you know, you asked about my early work on my book called Boarding School Seasons, which was my dissertation when I was in graduate school and became my first book. And I think of that book with I feel like I'm somewhat distant from it now in some ways because I did that research when I was kind of young and in my 20s. But I was so determined to write about Indian history in a way that I hadn't really heard or read when I studied history, and that was to make Native people the center of the story. That sounds like such an obvious thing to say, but it hadn't happened, really, when Native people were written about in historical. They were always the people kind of acted upon and never the real agents of history. And so with kids in government boarding schools, I started to find when I went into archives that there were all sorts of letters and documents that children, students, and family members and Indian people had written about the boarding school experience. And so I used all of those letters to try to tell the history of Native people's experiences in government boarding schools. My grandmother had been a boarding school student in the 20s. Her dad, my great-grandfather, had been one of the early students from Wood Lake, my community, to attend the Carlisle School in Pennsylvania, which was one of the earliest of these off-reservation boarding schools for the purpose of assimilation. But I learned more about that history and tried to write about what happened during the boarding school era. But the larger part of writing that book and doing that research that has really shaped my entire career as a historian is to always write history where Native people are the center of the story and they tell their perspectives of history. And as much as possible, I want them to be able to also to also hear their voices in the historical documents. So that's, in a nutshell, what I've tried to do all these years.
It's wonderful work. I love all your writings and books. And you use the term from the poet, survivance, for survival and resistance. And I love the stories you tell about the children who resisted and fought back against these institutions, like hopping on trains to leave Haskell, or cutting the power on speeches.
Yeah. Well, it's what I learned from doing that research is there's kind of a famous anthropologist, James Scott, whose work you may know, called Weapons. He wrote a book called Weapons of the Weak. And I like to think of kids in boarding school as kind of fitting into that that historical problem of people who are powerless and how they try to exercise power, which I think says something about, humanity, their humanity, right? That you think the most powerless people in the world were children in government boarding schools living away from their families and communities. And even in that context, they refuse to act powerless. Mm-hmm. So that's an inspiring story to me.
I've learned so much from your work, and I can't wait to read more. And you're working on a new children's literature project about baseball.
Yeah, not sure we came across that. That's in the works. I have a children's book called Bow Wow Powwow. That's a bilingual Ojibwe children's book that came out 2 years ago. And I'm working on another one right now about bears on the reservation. And so we're still debating the title of that, in fact. And I am going to write a children's book about baseball, because my brother was a really extraordinary baseball player growing up, but he encountered some racism as he went along, and I wanted to kind of talk about, what racism feels like when you're a kid through the writing of that book. So, yeah, I enjoy doing that too.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Time Talks podcast. Please check out Dr. Brenda Child's research and writings. I have links to her articles and books in the show notes. Please rate the show, share the show, check out the other amazing shows on the Channel Zero network. Show some love to awareness for the music, and see you next time.